Hi, my name is Kieran Jones, and I'm an acupuncturist here at the Pirani Clinic in Petaluma, California. Today we're going to be covering how to get your blood pressure down naturally, just the daily food choices you make. Blood pressure is a big problem. 1/6 of people between 8 and 17 have high blood pressure. Move up to the ages of 40 to 60, it becomes 1/3, and then the majority of people over 60, 2 out of every 3 people have hypertension. It is dangerous. For every 10 points of an increase in your systolic blood pressure, you increase your risk of stroke by 11%, your risk of cardiovascular disease by 10%, and you increase by 16% your risk of death from all causes. So you might wonder what exactly hypertension is, and the numbers appear as follows. Hypertension itself is above 140 or diastolic above 90. Anything in between about 120 and 140 is considered pre-hypertension, or between 80 and 90 in your diastolic. And then normal is anything under 120 over 80. So in order to monitor your own blood pressure, you want to go out and pick up a cuff. They now make them in both the wrist and arm cuffs. The wrist cuffs used to be pretty inaccurate, but we're finding nowadays that the wrist cuffs my patients bring in, or the ones that we've used in offices in the past, have been pretty accurate. So I think that the wrist cuffs are also a good option. Once you get it, bring it into your next appointment with your doctor, acupuncturist, or your chiropractor so they can double check it and make sure that the readings you get are accurate. And then when you're checking your blood pressure, make sure to do it at the same time every day. It doesn't necessarily have to be the first thing you do when you wake up in the morning, but a lot of people like to check it in the morning because they think they're getting the most accurate reading. What we'd like to do is just make sure that over the course of the day your blood pressure is going down. It can also be a good idea to check it at multiple points in the day. For instance, after lunch or when you've been active for a while. Check it then, and also check it when you're sedentary, and that way you'll get a good sense of what your blood pressure is doing throughout the course of the day. Alright, so why do we have high blood pressure? It's largely a result of our sedentary lifestyles. A lot of us spend our morning sitting to get to a job where we sit all day at a desk, and then finally get home exhausted and ready just to sit in front of the TV for several hours. Another cause is our constant emotional stress. And then lastly, the standard American diet is probably the biggest culprit. All the steps that we're going to give you today are addressing this, but don't forget about those other two causes too. A lot of people use prescriptions to treat blood pressure, and they can be effective at reducing your blood pressure, but the problem is that they're not addressing the underlying reason why your blood pressure was elevated in the first place. Sometimes that underlying cause can result in other problems in other systems of your body. So if you can use your blood pressure as, rather than a goal to get it down, use your blood pressure as an indicator that something's wrong. Address that underlying problem. When your blood pressure improves, you know that overall you're healthier, rather than just getting rid of that one symptom. Also, prescriptions do have some issues. They're typically only tested for 2 to 8 months in the clinical trials. That's how long they follow patients that are on these medications. But once those medications come to market, patients are sometimes on them for years or even decades, and they're never tested for that duration of use. So the kinds of side effects that can come up, they aren't anticipated until they get out in the public, and they're using you and I as the guinea pigs for it. Because they're not completely evaluated, sometimes they end up on the market with dangerous side effects, and they in turn have to get pulled from the market. For instance, just since the year 2000, this is all the drugs that have come to market only to be turned around and removed from the market when they discovered that they caused dangerous side effects in their patients. They can be a good first step in some, though. If your blood pressure is very, very high, it's appropriate to use prescriptions to bring it down quickly, because that's one of the great things that prescriptions can do, is they can bring your blood pressure down rapidly. But once it's reduced, diet and supplements should take over. Once the effects of improved diet and lifestyle have been able to take effect, you can take those blood pressure medications and throw them away. Get off your drugs. That's the goal. They aren't intended to be taken for the rest of your life. And of course, when you do come off your medication, make sure that you're working with your doctor in that process, and that they know that you're coming off and you're doing it with their permission. Sometimes there's important steps that need to be taken as you come off of a medication, such as tapering down your dose, or anticipating certain rebound effects that you need to watch out for. So it's okay to come off of them, just make sure you're doing that in cooperation with your medical doctor. For us, we would like to walk our patients through this transitioning process. If we get people with high blood pressure or people on blood pressure medication, we'd like to get them to move from using that blood pressure medication to using a supplement or using targeted nutritional intervention, and then finally just using their lifestyle and their natural diet to keep their blood pressure low. So that's our goal for you, and using the steps that we're going to give you in this talk, you should be able to do that too. So our dietary solutions to hypertension, what do they include? Well, one thing they don't include is a big reliance on reducing your sodium intake. So the main dietary recommendation for a long time has been the reduction of sodium, but it turns out this isn't really the best intervention. The recommendations are less than 2,300 milligrams per day, according to the Institute of Medicine. And then if you meet certain guidelines, then the Dietary Advisor Guidelines recommend that you get down to 1,500 milligrams per day. And that ends up, when you look at those guidelines, that ends up being the recommended dosage for the majority of Americans. What they're missing is the idea that moderation is a good thing in all nutrients. There's this idea of kind of a bell curve in the intake of any particular nutrient, such that too much of that thing can cause problems in the body, but also too little of that thing can cause problems in the body. We have this understanding of salt being this evil nutrient, and we need to reduce it to as close to zero as possible. But optimal intake tends to be somewhere in the middle. The same thing applies to cholesterol. Cholesterol has been vilified in mainstream medicine as well. And the thought seemed to be in the past that if we could only get our patients down to zero cholesterol, they would be perfectly healthy. When in fact the ideal health is somewhere in the middle. The best benefits come with a moderate amount of that thing. And the same thing definitely applies to sodium. There was a big study in 2013. The National Academies of Science put together a massive review totaling over 200 pages in which they reviewed all the available research on sodium and its impact on blood pressure. They found that the majority of the studies that show that sodium restriction reduces health measures or mortality outcomes basically used poor methodology. So the sodium recommendations were based on bad science. In patients with existing or later stage congestive heart disease, they found sodium restriction to the recommended 1,500 milligrams per day may even increase the risk of having a heart attack. They concluded that sodium restriction has benefits only when the consumption is very, very high to start with. In other words, if you're on the upside of that bell curve, consuming around 5,000 milligrams per day, getting your consumption down is definitely appropriate so you can be in that optimal range in the middle. But there's no evidence to support a benefit from reduction to 2,300 milligrams or below. Furthermore, they found that reducing sodium too far increases the circulating levels of triglycerides, which further increases the heart disease risk. Certainly not the goal of sodium restriction. So unfortunately, this sodium restriction approach has been the mainstay of conventional medicine's dietary treatment of hypertension for decades, and as a result, it's not a surprise that hypertension continues to rise as a health concern in America. Our recommendations for lowering blood pressure with diet is quite simple, but it's also basically the foundation of a good, healthy diet to start with. So if you follow this diet, the benefits are going to appear in many other areas of your health besides just hypertension. We think that getting closer in line with the diet that your body is designed to eat ends up resulting in better health in a lot of areas. The way that we want to think about sodium is in ratio to the amount of potassium you're getting. So if you're getting sufficient potassium, we're not too concerned about your sodium intake, even if it is on the upper range of that bell curve. Some diets tried to treat blood pressure by loading sodium, and they were able to lower blood pressure, but the reason wasn't the low sodium. In the DASH diet, for instance, it's a sodium-reduced diet, and they found that they were able to lower blood pressure, but it wasn't because of the low sodium, it was because of the high amount of potassium in this diet. The diet is rich in whole fruits and vegetables and low in refined carbohydrates, all of which results in more potassium in the diet. Other studies were able to lower blood pressure in ways that the researchers did not anticipate. So the A to Z study is an example of that. It was published in the Journal of the American Medical Association, And they compared a lot of different diets, two of which were the Dean Ornish diet, which is a very, very low fat diet designed to improve heart disease risk. And another one of the diets they looked at was the Atkins diet, and kind of diametric opposite of the Dean Ornish diet, very high in fat, very, very low in carbohydrates. When they analyzed the endpoints, they were surprised to find that the Atkins group actually had the most substantial improvements in weight loss, in improved cholesterol numbers, both a reduction in LDL and an increase in their good cholesterol, and also improved blood sugars and insulin. The other thing they found was that parallel to the group changes in weight, the decrease in mean blood pressure level was also largest in the Atkins group at all time points. So we can learn a lot by thinking about why this is. And one of the things that could be is that metabolic health plays an important role in blood pressure. Multiple studies have found a relationship between insulin resistance and higher blood pressure. So reducing your carbohydrate intake can improve blood pressure by restoring insulin sensitivity and reducing your circulating insulin levels. So improving metabolic health can also reduce blood pressure. But there's two other things that are important that the Atkins diet and the DASH diet have in common. One is that they have a reduction in processed foods, and the other is that they have an increase in the number of micronutrients you're getting per calorie. That's referred to as nutrient density. This micronutrient intake is important because there's a lot of key nutrients that play a role in keeping your blood pressure down. We already talked about potassium, but also magnesium, bioflavonoids, CoQ10, alpha lipoic acid, and nitric oxide precursors are all important in maintaining a good, healthy, lower blood pressure. And in a diet that's very nutrient dense and high in these micronutrients, you can expect to have a lower blood pressure as a result. So if we take those lessons that we learned from looking at that information, we can put them into these three steps basically. We want to increase your potassium intake, we want to improve your metabolic state, and then lastly we want to increase your micronutrient intake. Now if you can follow those three things and construct your diet in such a way that you're meeting those three goals, I guarantee you that your blood pressure will go down. So step one is improve your potassium intake. The recommended daily allowance for potassium is 4,700 milligrams per day for adults. In my experience, when people start working with me and looking at their nutritional value, they're typically getting around 2,500 milligrams per day. So certainly insufficient intake of potassium. These are some of the foods that are highest in potassium. And here's the content of some common foods. If you want to pause the talk here and write these down, go ahead. There's a lot of other great resources online. And here's an example of a menu for a day that gets you up over that 4,700 milligrams. A lot of these are the meals that I typically have. You'll notice the lack of a lot of processed foods here. There's a piece of toast and there's some ice cream, but it's homemade ice cream. Also notice that this isn't a monastery diet. This is certainly some healthy food, but it's also enjoyable food. All these things are pretty tasty, and we don't include the spices and oils and condiments that help them to be tasty. But just because you're eating healthy doesn't mean you have to eat bland food. Step two is to improve your metabolism. So elevated insulin reduces the availability of magnesium, and magnesium is an important vasodilator. So it actually makes your blood vessels dilate by relaxing the smooth muscles that go around your blood vessels. When those blood vessels dilate, you're taking the same volume of blood and putting it into a larger container, which means lower blood pressure. The other thing that insulin does is it increases the amount of sodium that your kidneys retain and keeps sodium in your body, which results in higher blood pressure. In order to improve your metabolism, you need to improve your glycemic response. So your metabolism comes down to what happens with your blood sugar after you eat. That's what your glycemic response is. One way to look at that is to look at the glycemic load of your foods. So the glycemic load is a measurement of how quickly a serving of given food raises your blood sugar. Repeated rapid increases in blood sugar result in damaged metabolic response and blood pressure, but it also results in weight gain, diabetes, and increased heart disease risk. So here's one piece of the glycemic load table, you'll see the food on the left, and then the glycemic index of it, and then the glycemic load is that next column over. So glycemic load is a little bit more valuable in terms of real information about what the food's doing. It would be pretty daunting to refer to this list every time you're making a meal. And in fact, I wouldn't recommend that you do that. The reason is that sometimes that's giving you bad information. The glycemic load table is giving you information for that food's health on only one metric. It's not looking at all the other aspects of that food and why it's not healthy. So, for example, if we look at quinoa and white flour pasta according to the glycemic load table, quinoa has a glycemic load of 50, which is relatively high, whereas white flour pasta has a much lower glycemic load of 19. So from the glycemic load table alone, you would think that white flour pasta is a healthier option, when in fact the opposite is true. Quinoa is a complete protein giving you all the essential amino acids your body needs, whereas white flour pasta has about half the protein completeness. Quinoa has 318 milligrams of potassium, whereas white flour pasta is mostly empty carbohydrates. There's not a whole lot of other nutrients there. Quinoa is also high in magnesium, folate, and iron, and gives you 5 grams of fiber per serving, whereas white flour pasta has only about half the fiber. So you can see that it's not really the greatest approach using just the glycemic load, but there are other ways to think about foods that tend to correlate pretty well with the glycemic load, and that's something I call looking at a food regarding number of steps from the ground. So when you're looking at a food and thinking about what to choose, you want to think about how many steps of processing it took to get that food from its origin to your table. The more steps involved, the less healthy that food, and it tends to be the case that also the higher that food's glycemic load. So let's look at an example. Let's take corn on the cob, and here it is, relatively straight from the field. Of course, you can doctor it up and use some spices and some seasonings and use some good cooking techniques to make it, but ultimately it looks exactly the way it did. There's no extra processing here. If we run this corn through one step of processing, maybe we'll get cornmeal, and it can be relatively coarse or it can be relatively fine. Each of those represents more and more steps of processing. So the coarser the cornmeal, actually, the lower its glycemic load. As it gets ground more and more and more and more processed, it becomes higher on the glycemic load. So one step to cornmeal, another step maybe to corn flour, and more processing, less healthy. Let's take a little bit further and turn it into corn flakes. Another step of processing added, much more convenient and much quicker carbohydrates. You're going to get into your bloodstream a lot faster, and you're going to end up with a increased response from your insulin, and you're going to end up with a decrease in metabolic health and higher blood pressure. You can take it even a step further and turn that corn right into high fructose corn syrup, and certainly not news to anybody listening to this that this stuff is not good for you. Very high on the glycemic load, and also causes derangement in a lot of other ways. The high fructose content does kind of a trick with your body and contributes to fatty liver disease and increased triglycerides. So pretty easy to see that the more steps of processing a food goes through, the less healthy it is. We really want to get it as close to that natural form as we can. And then step 3 is to increase your micronutrient intake. Basically get more nutrients in per calorie. Good example of two foods with high and low micronutrient intake or nutrient density. Broccoli on the left, not a whole lot of calories, but a whole lot of vitamins and minerals. And then some more pasta on the right. I'm not just trying to bash pasta today, but it's a convenient example because it is very low in nutrient density. Lots and lots of calories, lots of carbohydrates, but not a whole lot of nutrients. So for a definition, nutrient density is a measurement of a food's potency in terms of vitamins, minerals, and phytonutrients per calorie. Some of these nutrients are particularly important when it comes to blood pressure. We covered potassium already, but magnesium, nitric oxide precursors, and bioflavonoids are the 3 that we'll talk about briefly right now. So about half of Americans are failing to get their sufficient daily magnesium in, and so it's no wonder so many of us have high blood pressure. A British medical journal study found that a reduction of 12 points systolic and 8 points diastolic in blood pressure with supplementation of only 270 milligrams of magnesium in a group of 18 hypertensive patients. And that's a pretty immediate response in the study that happened within 5 or 6 hours. And here's a example of a food that's particularly high in magnesium. Almonds and spinach are both very high. Also cashews, peanuts, black beans, edamame, avocado, potato, brown rice, and yogurt. These are all good sources of magnesium. Next nutrients we want to talk about are nitric oxide precursors. So nitric oxide is a signaling molecule that causes the blood vessels to dilate. So your body uses certain nutrients in your food to make this, and then uses the nitric oxide to tell the blood vessels to dilate, to open up, allow more blood to move through, reducing blood pressure. So if you can increase your dietary intake of the things your body uses to make nitric oxide, you can end up with more nitric oxide activity and a lower blood pressure. There are two main routes to make nitric oxide in the body. One are nitrates that come from fruits and vegetables, and the other one is L-arginine, and that's a protein you get in a lot of meats. You can also take it as a supplement. So nitrates and nitrites come from fruits and vegetables mainly. They serve as the building blocks for nitric oxide, and increasing their intake results in more circulation through the blood vessels and lowers blood pressure. They were also made famous in the past two Summer Olympics because during the Olympics it becomes very, very difficult to find raw beet juice within 100 miles of the Olympic Village. The reason is that a lot of endurance and performance athletes are using foods that are high in nitrates, like beet juice, to increase the function in nitric oxide, because it's dilating blood vessels, remember, which means that you're able to get more blood and more oxygen out to your muscles, allowing you to improve the function of those muscles during a time of increased work. A lot of people, when they hear the words nitrates and nitrites, think of bacon, sausage, processed meats. Nitrates and nitrites can be added to those foods as a preserving agent, and they are also found naturally, and sometimes when you choose a preserved meat that says nitrate and nitrate free, what's actually being added is the natural source of that, like beet juice or celery juice, a vegetable that's very high in nitrates. The cancer association with processed meat has less to do with the nitrates and nitrites than it does with the aromatic hydrocarbons that are created from cooking the foods. And so in my opinion, and in the conclusion of the medical literature up to date, nitrates and nitrites are not something to worry about in your diet. And in fact, you'll get more of them from eating a single stalk of celery than you will from eating a dozen different hot dogs. So hopefully that puts that to rest. And you know that getting more vegetables in is certainly a safe thing to do, regardless of the nitrate content in them. One study that I found in Hypertension Journal in 2010, supplementation of 450 milligrams of nitrates were able to result in a reduction of more than 5 points within just a few hours in systolic blood pressure. It also has a reduction in diastolic blood pressure. Some of the best sources of natural nitrates include raw beet juice, as we said, spinach, kale, carrots, arugula, and celery, and really all the vegetables. If you're using vegetables regularly in a wide variety, you're getting plenty of nitrates in. L-arginine can also be very effective. A 2011 meta-analysis found that L-arginine was effective at lowering both systolic and diastolic blood pressure. The dosages range from 4 to 24 grams per day. Some of the dietary sources of that are pork loin, turkey, chicken, pumpkin seeds, and soy. And for a rapid effect, you probably want to take a supplement so that you can get enough in. You want to take between 3 and 6 grams per day. And the third category were bioflavonoids. So flavonoids are a class of compounds found in citrus, berries, wine, tea, coffee, soy, and chocolate. They support the formation of healthy blood vessels, skin, and collagen. So they're important micronutrients. Because we don't consume a whole lot of fruits and vegetables typically in the West, the standard American diet is definitely lacking them. We don't end up getting enough of these because they're an important building block for our body to make all these different tissues. can end up with not only higher blood pressure but also makes the skin age faster. You might see varicosities in the veins more commonly in people that aren't getting enough of these in. So there's a lot of good reasons to try and consume more bioflavonoids. Their effects on blood pressure have been confirmed by lots and lots of studies. There was in 2008 a big meta-analysis, which is a study of studies. And this meta-analysis looked at 133 different trials and concluded that flavonoids from tea, chocolate, and other sources reduced both systolic and diastolic blood pressure in both the short and the long term. Some good sources include coffee, tea, cocoa, grapes, raisins, dark-colored berries, onions, citrus, herbs, capers, and so on and so forth. But rather than searching for these specifically, just maintain that practice of eating close to the ground, removing those steps between your food and your plate, and you'll end up getting a whole lot of these compounds in. So to review those 3 steps, number 1 is increase your potassium intake, and I would recommend keeping that on paper. As you go through the day, look at the intake that you're getting in each meal and write that down, and keep a running tab going through the day. You'll find after you do that a few days that it can be pretty difficult to get 4,700 if you're eating kind of the typical American foods. You find that you start moving to a much more natural and less processed diet, it'll be easy to go well above 4,700 milligrams per day. When it comes to potassium intake, if you have kidney issues, especially kidney issues that result in excreting less potassium, you want to be very careful. Patients usually know, their doctors and their nutritionists are pretty on them about keeping their potassium intake down. But if you belong in that group, then definitely review with your doctor before you try to increase your potassium intake. For everybody else out there, 4,700 is the goal. Step 2 is to reduce your glycemic load, and the good way to do that is just keep eating closer to the ground. Look for those foods that have minimal processing. And the third step is to increase the nutrient density, and again, you can do that just by reducing steps of processing and trying to eat foods in their natural states as much as possible. So thanks everybody for listening. I just wanted to, as a final note, point out that this sort of a diet sounds like a treatment. When you have high blood pressure, this is the treatment we recommend. But I would suggest that rather than a treatment, this is really a reminder of what happens when you step out of your body's natural physiological diet. You're designed to eat a certain kinds of foods. We've been eating a certain kinds of foods for a long time and getting particular nutrients in. And when we shift away from that and start eating other foods that are more processed or more artificial, we start developing issues. You're going to develop blood pressure problems and things like that. So I would think of this less as a treatment and more as a reminder of what happens when you move away from the natural diet. Just need to get ourselves back into that natural diet, and those symptoms and those conditions start to fall away. So again, thank you so much for watching, and again, my name is Kieran Jones at the Pirani Clinic in Petaluma, California. Feel free to go to our website to download our free ebook and get more information, and look forward to chatting with you again next time.